Hey, this is Molly Patrick, and you're listening to the Clean Food Dirty Girl podcast. We are all about helping people eat more plants and celebrating imperfection as we navigate life's messiness. Hey there, and thanks for listening to this episode or watching this episode of the Clean Food Dirty Girl podcast. I have a big treat for you today. I have Dr. Hana Kahleova, and she is super wicked smart, and we're going to be talking all things plant-based and the body and all kinds of good things. So Dr. Hana Kahleova, thank you for joining us. I'm really happy for you to be here and to make this appearance and to help this community just understand more about plants and the role that they play in the body. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. I love having experts on the show, and you are indeed an expert. You are an endocrinologist, a researcher, an author, and a speaker who is passionate about finding the most effective ways about how to reverse chronic disease through proper nutrition and healthy lifestyle. You are actually as well the director of clinical research at the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. PCRM is a fantastic organization. I've talked to many of your colleagues and have really just appreciated that resource and all it provides for so long. And then you've published more than a dozen nutrition studies, and you have your doctorate in nutrition with an emphasis on diabetes. Is that right?
Yeah, my PhD is in human physiology and pathophysiology, which are the mechanisms, in the body. How does nutrition affect our body? And more specifically, what are the mechanisms that are affected?
Okay, this is so good. So yes, we are in good hands with you. You are quite the expert. I just kind of want to use this as a starting off point and just ask, with the updated guidelines, there's a lot of emphasis on meat and red meat and dairy and high fat dairy, and there's very little emphasis on plant-based foods. In fact, if you dig through the realfood.gov website, you actually see a whole section about vegetarian and vegan diets that's kind of alarming. And I spoke with Dr. Anna kind of about that and where that information was extrapolated from. But I would love to get your just broad kind of spectrum expert advice that if somebody was actually going to follow those guidelines as they are written, as they are suggested and laid out, can you tell us a little bit about some concerns with that?
Absolutely. Well, number one, we need to take into consideration how these dietary guidelines came into existence. So the scientific report, which has been produced over the past 2 years as a recommendation and as a basis for the dietary recommendations, the scientific report has been just set aside. So the doctors who worked on it, for 2 years, the evidence has been set aside. And 8 of the 9 panelists on the dietary panel had direct ties to food industry, meat and dairy industry, and low carbohydrate products, that are being pushed and that are being sold. And this is simply unacceptable, because when we look at something that's not evidence-based and where the people who are recommending them are actually benefiting from selling more meat and dairy and low carbohydrate products, this is something that's unacceptable.
Hey there, we're going to take a real quick pause, and I'm going to ask you this. Are you tired of doing mental gymnastics when it comes to dinner? And would it totally light you up if you had a constant flow of healthy, delicious, plant-powered meals without the stress of planning or crossing your fingers that it's going to be yummy? That's exactly why we created our Clean Food Dirty Girl Meal Plan Club. Every week, you follow our done-for-you plant-based meal plans, complete with grocery lists and simple batch cooking instructions. No more guesswork, no more wasted food, no more recipe fails, and no more wondering what's for dinner. All you have to do is follow along, and healthy, delicious dinner is at your fingertips all week long. Our members say it's their secret system for saving time, eating healthier, and finally finding their plant-based flow. When you're ready to ditch the mental gymnastics of figuring out dinner, head over to cleanfooddirtygirl.com and click on Meal Plan Club to join the fun. Okay, now back to our awesome episode.
So the Physicians Committee has asked the government to retract these dietary guidelines. That's number one. Number two, since the evidence has been set aside, that was supposed to be the basis for the dietary guidelines, let's look at the evidence and the recommendations for the dietary guidelines. And they actually said the opposite. They recommended that Americans are deficient in fiber. We need to make sure that we consume more fiber. Specifically, we need to make sure that people consume more legumes, more beans and lentils and peas. Those are the richest sources of fiber, and the average Americans don't consume them as they should. And number two would be whole grains. Fruits and vegetables have been emphasized to the public. Even in those categories, people fall short. But the biggest gap is in legumes and whole grains. And so, back to your question, what would happen if somebody actually followed the new dietary pyramid? Well, it's easy. When you put meat and cheese at the center of your plate on the same level as vegetables, you will very quickly exceed the recommendations for saturated fat. And those recommendations for saturated fat come from all the societies as evidence-based guidelines, like the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association. All these societies are recommending to cut down on saturated fat. So there's no way to put meat and cheese at the center of your plate and not exceed the recommended intake for saturated fat.
Yeah, that's kind of impossible. And I mean, I guess it goes without saying, those guidelines from all those other organizations or those recommendations, those haven't changed. Right? There's no, there hasn't been new evidence.
They're evidence-based.
Right.
They're evidence-based, so they haven't changed.
Yeah.
In contrast to these guidelines that are not evidence-based.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's really the bottom line for people to keep in mind, is that these updated guidelines are not evidence-based. And so follow them at your own peril, I guess.
Yes,
because there's no science that backs up that this is the way to go. So I want to talk a little bit about the mechanism, we talked about that, of saturated fat, since we were just talking about that in the body, and when we exceed a certain amount, what actually goes on in our body.
So the first thing that happens is that all the fat we eat is being incorporated in our cell membranes. You may recall from biochemistry that each cell has a membrane made of phospholipid bilayer. And the phospholipids, you hear the word lipids, which is for fat. So all the fat we eat in the diet is being incorporated in the cell membranes. Now, the saturated fat, butter is solid. It's like a brick. And you can kind of picture that the membranes in your body will also become more rigid as a result of eating the saturated fat. In contrast, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat from plants, these fats make the cell membranes more flexible. Now, why is that important? Well, the insulin receptor is embedded in the cell membrane. So that means if we eat a lot of saturated fat and the cell membranes become more rigid, this is the underlying cause of insulin resistance. Now the insulin receptor and the insulin cascade is not working properly because the cell membrane is just more rigid. And so that's the underlying cause of, pre-diabetes and diabetes down the road.
Okay. So, and is that specific to saturated fat, or is that an overconsumption of all types of fat as well?
So this composition of the cell membranes is about the ratio of the fat that we're consuming and the proportion of saturated fat that we're consuming. So too much of the saturated fat in particular is the underlying cause of insulin resistance in the cell membrane. But it doesn't end there because our adipose tissue has only a certain capacity to store fat. It's like, your fridge has a certain capacity to take in all the food that you bring home. And now if we just consume too much and too much, especially the calories coming from fat add up quickly, because 1 gram of fat has 9 calories, in contrast to carbohydrate and protein that have only 4. So, the calories from fat add up super quickly, and now the fridge is full, and what to do with the extra fat? Well, it needs to go somewhere. The fridge is full, so it'll go on the counter and in the living room and, in the bedroom. And so this is exactly what the body is doing. The extra fat is now being stored in the organs, such as the liver and the muscle and the pancreas and the heart. Doesn't sound healthy, does it?
No.
It's like, having soy milk that's supposed to be stored in the fridge on your counter for 2 weeks, probably not a good idea. So it's disrupting to the metabolism, and it's further disrupting to the insulin cascade. And this represents another mechanism, which is the underlying cause of insulin resistance. So, in other words, if you eat too much fat of any kind, this will also cause insulin resistance by this mechanism.
Okay, well, I liked your analogy. My brain appreciates a good analogy, so I like that one of the food in the fridge. If there's too much, it'll start going other places in your kitchen or your house, and we don't want that. We want the food in the fridge.
That's right.
Okay, so that is so that's great. So that's the saturated fat portion of it, and in these guidelines, they're really recommending whole fat dairy products and meat, right? So let's just talk about saturated fat. So I know that there are some plant-based sources of saturated fat, but can you talk a little bit about animal sources of saturated fat versus plant sources of saturated fat?
We know from studies that compare coconut oil that's high in saturated fat with butter and their effect on cholesterol. And coconut oil is not as bad as butter, but somewhere in between, is not as good as other sources, other plant sources of fat that don't have as much saturated fat. So even though these tropical oils, such as coconut oil or palm oil, contain a lot of saturated fat, they don't contain cholesterol, which is a good thing. So they will still raise your cholesterol in the body, but not as much as butter. But still, we want to keep them super low. I know that nowadays so many vegan products contain a lot of coconut oil. We need to be careful with these products.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with our meal plans and our recipes, we've always been oil free, and that's why a lot of people sign up for them and follow them, because even though they're already avoiding animal products, they really want to get as much fat out of the diet as possible and just rely more on the seeds and some nuts and some avocados and stuff like that. And so we've been seeing that, and we've seen that be very effective for people who are managing or who are even reversing like pre-diabetes or even type 2 diabetes.
Absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit about, I had a question from somebody in our community, and the question was, what food, if you're already eating a whole food plant-based diet, so you're avoiding animal products, you're avoiding overly processed foods, you're avoiding oil, are there any other foods to be aware of if you are type 2 diabetic or if you have prediabetes?
That's an excellent question. Um, you know, if you have diabetes, then a whole food plant-based diet and keeping the fat content super low will definitely help you. Another aspect to keep in mind is that it's not only what we eat, but also when we eat. So having breakfast every single day has been shown to be beneficial for glycemic control for people with type 2 diabetes. In a study, they gave half of people breakfast and half of people didn't consume any breakfast. And those who skipped breakfast, their mean glycemic control or their mean blood sugar throughout the whole day was 20% higher throughout the whole day. So eating breakfast keeps your blood sugar stable and will decrease the blood sugar throughout the whole day. So we know the proverb, eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And we decided to test this proverb in a research study. And we compared, in people with type 2 diabetes, we compared 6 small meals during the day with only 2 meals a day, breakfast and lunch. The same calories, the same diet, and people lost 50% more weight on 2 meals a day. Their insulin sensitivity improved more, their liver fat was reduced more. And what's also interesting is that the depressive symptoms were reduced more on 2 meals a day. People just felt better. And the kicker is that people reported less hunger on 2 meals a day than on 6 small meals. So the short answer, a whole food plant-based diet for somebody with diabetes is a wonderful start. But the second recommendation is also pay attention to when you eat. If 2 meals a day, breakfast and lunch, seems like too big of a shift right away, maybe you can make dinner the lightest meal of the day. Just have a salad and push it a bit earlier in the day. And then you may eventually just replace it with an apple, like in the late afternoon, and then you skip an apple and have just water instead, and you're on 2 meals a day. And number 3 is obviously physical activity. We know that physical activity is important for all of us, but particularly for people with type 2 diabetes. And when it comes to different kinds of physical activity, high intensity interval training has been shown the most efficient way, not only for weight control, but also for glycemic control in people with type 2 diabetes. High intensity interval training is very easy. You don't need long stretches of time. You only need 10 or 15 minutes a few times a week. And the principle is for 30 seconds, you, let's say, run or jump on a trampoline or do something, to almost max out your heart rate. Not quite, but very close, like at least 80% of your maximal heart rate. And then for 10 seconds, you let your heart rate come down again, and then again for 30 seconds you go all out. You can find many videos that will just do it for you. You can do jumping jacks, and you can do push-ups, and you can do so many things. So there are many videos that you can just follow, or you can do your own workout. And the beauty of this approach is that you only need 10 to 15 minutes a few times a week. And it's been shown to be a game changer for cardiometabolic health. So we have what we eat, a whole food plant-based diet, and keep the fat content low. Number 2 is when you eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. Number 3 is exercise, and particularly the high intensity interval training. And number 4 is sleep. That may be surprising to many people, but the American Diabetes Association has put sleep on the same level with nutrition and exercise in the last dietary guidelines. Because it's been shown that both the length and the quality of sleep can really help with glycemic control and are important in the prevention and treatment of diabetes. So get at least 8 hours of sleep a night and go to bed early rather than late. So if you're somebody who consistently goes to bed after midnight, maybe this week go to bed 15 minutes earlier than usual. And then next week, move it up again by 15 minutes. And, week by week, you can gradually adjust your bedtime and you can get up earlier and you will have more energy. And your body, as a result, your body will be able to produce more melatonin, because you probably know the proverb, an hour of sleep before midnight equals 2 hours of sleep after midnight. And it's true because of the melatonin secretion. Melatonin goes up when it gets dark. So if we just stay up and have all the lights, around us, we prevent this melatonin going up. And melatonin is the youth hormone. And it's also involved in glucose control. So we want to keep it high as possible by going to bed early and getting our 8 hours of sleep.
Okay, well, that was a lot of very good information. And for anybody who is pre-diabetic or has type 2 diabetes, I mean, that's really a lot of very good information. Do we produce less melatonin as we age?
That's right. Yeah, our melatonin production goes down. It's not only about going to bed early, but it's also being exposed to sunshine and natural sunlight during the day. So your good sleep at night starts in the morning. Ideally, in the morning, you want to go outside for at least 5 minutes. It doesn't take long, but the 5 minutes is critical because your body will get the natural sunlight, and that will help spike the melatonin secretion at night much more than when we don't have the natural sunlight.
Oh, interesting. And so when you do that, should you ideally be directly in the sun?
So it doesn't matter whether you're directly in the sun. Let's say you go for a walk in a park or in a forest. Those trees and those green plants, they absorb the infrared light, and they will shine it back to you. So it's more about the infrared light than the ultraviolet. Obviously, you want to avoid going to the sun when it's too sharp. You want to avoid getting burned, and ideally in the morning or in the later portion of the day.
Okay, that's wonderful. Those are all wonderful tips and doable. I mean, that these things are not that complicated. And I like what you said about sort of, okay, if you usually go to bed at midnight, just do 15 minutes earlier. See how that works.
Yeah.
And maybe another 15 minutes earlier. I think, there's people who really like to go like all in with something, and then there's people who just need to kind of taper off of things. So I think that that's a great reminder too, that it doesn't have to be all or nothing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, so that kind of hits on the diabetes topic and why those food guidelines are like quite problematic, actually, in regards to diabetes. Let's talk a little bit about heart disease. If we can kind of go to that topic now, and sort of the mechanisms about that, and not only the potential, or the harm that animal-based products produce, but also the benefits then of eating whole plant foods. How does that protect the heart and what's going on kind of like inside the body while that's happening?
Yeah, there are a few mechanisms why animal products are harmful to the heart. One of them is saturated fat, one of them is heme iron. But another mechanism that we studied in our studies is the so-called dietary acid load. And that means how acidic the animal products are. The dietary acid load can be calculated as a simple formula. It's a function of protein and phosphorus, and you subtract magnesium, potassium, and calcium. And so the animal products are particularly high in dietary acid load. And when we compare meat and cheese, cheese is about 3 times higher in dietary acid load compared with meat. And when we look at plants, they're much lower in the dietary acids. Like half or even third of what we see in animal products. And many plants, like fruits and vegetables, they're actually alkaline. That means their dietary acid load is in negative numbers. They're alkalizing for the body. So the difference can be quite stark between different meals that are animal-based or plant-based. And what effect does it have when we eat more alkaline foods? Well, it has beneficial effects on our metabolism. When the dietary acid load shifts and is lower on a plant-based diet by default, then it's been associated with weight loss and improved insulin sensitivity and improved body composition. So that means that the alkalinity of the plant-based diet is just one of the mechanisms that plays a role. You've probably seen alkaline water in the grocery stores.
Mm-hmm.
If you like the taste and if you don't mind spending the money, go for it. But the most effective way to shift your pH balance is actually eating more plant foods, particularly fruits and vegetables. And the champion when it comes to alkalinity is the leafy greens. Those are the most alkaline foods. So make sure you have your leafy greens with all your meals, because they will be most alkalizing for your body.
Okay. And that is, and it really sounds like that is good for overall health, not just heart health, but like the whole thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Because it's been shown that a higher dietary acid load has been also associated with chronic diseases such as cancer, particularly breast cancer and colon cancer and prostate cancer and gastric cancer, all kinds of cancer. The people whose diet was the most acidic had a 66% higher chance of getting cancer of any kind.
Wow, that's
compared
a
with
lot.
those whose diet was much more alkaline. So it plays a role in all chronic diseases, not only cardiovascular disease and diabetes.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. My mom, she's 82 now, but she was a hippie, and she grew up, or I was raised, vegetarian and mainly plant-based, and um she's been whole food plant-based specifically since 1997. She's in great shape. She's very healthy. She has lots of energy. She's never had any major problems. And she's always talked to me ever since I was little. I remember her talking about that alkaline um
Yeah.
thing, and she's like, we don't want, you don't want your system to be too acidic. We need to like alkaline it. And so she would, we were always eating fruits and veggies and all of this, and she was always talking about that. So I'm going to send her this episode when it's out and just say, okay, you were right. There was something to that. So let's yeah, and the other thing I
Well,
was
kudos
thought,
to your mom,
yeah.
because, like, we didn't have that many research studies at that time.
Yeah,
She
I
was ahead of
know.
time.
She was really ahead of her time. She really, really was. And it was just sort of luck that she even got into it. And it was actually a doctor of hers. And so he was really ahead of his time. But anyways, I was talking when I had the talk with Dr. Herbie, we were talking about how it's like beans and leafy greens. It's always like, it seems like beans and leafy greens, I mean, all the plant foods are important, but it seems like those are just such powerhouses and such, should be such staples in everybody's diet because of like the plethora of
Yeah,
goodness that they provide.
absolutely.
So can we talk about inflammation a little bit? Because that's a big thing right now. It's kind of like a buzzword. I hear a lot about it. And so let's dive into inflammation. What causes it? What can help it? And what do you know about it? Give us your expertise.
Inflammation develops in the body fairly quickly after a high-fat meal that's animal-based. And it's a defense mechanism. Lipopolysaccharides are being released from the gastrointestinal system, from the gut bacteria, and this just causes low-grade inflammation. And it's also fairly easy to fix it. When we eat plants that contain a lot of fiber, the fiber feeds the good guys in the gut, and now these have anti-inflammatory effects. So there's different types of bacteria. Like we have families, and families talk to each other, and gut bacteria are the same. There are different families that talk to each other, and some families are bigger, some families are smaller, some families are virtuous, and some not so much. And so
Another good analogy. Okay, I like it.
some gut bacteria families are anti-inflammatory. They're the good guys, such as Prevotella and Bacteroidetes. And some families are actually promoting inflammation in the body, and that would be the family Firmicutes. And for example, in one study, they looked at children living in Burkina Faso in rural Africa, and they compared these children with children living in Italy. And obviously the diet was so much different. The children in rural Africa, they ate, mostly a plant-based diet. The children in Italy, a lot of animal products. And so it also showed in their gut microbiome. The children living in Africa, they had a lot of Bacteroidetes that are anti-inflammatory, and a lot of Prevotella, which are beneficial families of bacteria. The children living in Italy, hardly any of these families were present, and it was the opposite. They had a lot of Firmicutes, the family that's promoting inflammation. So what we eat has profound effects on the composition of our gut microbiome, and it just shows in the inflammatory markers that we can measure, and it has profound effects on our risk of heart disease down the road.
Okay. And is there any other like problems that can occur later on if the inflammation is high? Is it just heart disease, or is there other problems that could happen as well because of inflammation?
Increased inflammation is present in many other chronic diseases, such as metabolic syndrome and diabetes, and also cancer. It's one of the underlying causes of all the chronic diseases.
Okay, so that's really powerful to know.
And we should also touch on neuroinflammation and Alzheimer's disease, because inflammation also plays a role in these types of diseases.
Yeah, and it seems like there's been some interesting research coming out about that, like fairly recently, in the past like 5 years or so, where a lot more is known now than it was about that. Can you talk about some of those studies?
The most encouraging study that has been published in the last 2 years is Dr. Ornish's study. He took people in early stages of Alzheimer's disease, and he put them on a plant-based diet, He put them on an exercise program, and they also had stress management, and they had group sessions to support each other. So it was a comprehensive program. And he showed that the cognitive function was actually improved in the intervention group compared with the control group who just received usual care. So this is really encouraging, because we're now not only talking about the prevention and the importance of lifestyle in preventing diseases like Alzheimer's disease, but now it looks like even the early stages can be reversed if people follow a comprehensive lifestyle like this. Obviously, we need to take into account that most of the people needed the support from their families, from their spouse, from other family members, because they would not be able to follow the program by themselves. So, in other words, we don't want to get to that point ourselves. We want to prevent as much as possible, and we'd like to support everybody who's in our family and may need such a change in their lifestyle.
Yeah, there's just so many reasons to adopt this way of eating and to move your body and to implement these healthy lifestyle changes. And it's the longer you do it, the better, but also like it's never too late. We see a lot of people coming into our community who are in their early to mid 50s who are wanting to make some changes because of some news they got from their doctor or some labs that came back not and they weren't so happy with. And so we see that a lot. We see a lot of people making these changes kind of midlife, and people get amazing results. But I think in this country anyways, there's not a lot of emphasis on prevention. It's very much, there's a problem, let's look at it then. And so I think just reminding people that like the preventative side of all this is so important, and it's never too late to start too, if you've never done it.
Absolutely. I agree.
So let's talk about, can we talk about osteoporosis for a minute? Because there's a lot of people in our community who are concerned with getting enough calcium, concerned about osteoporosis. So I just want to sort of hit on that. Can you speak a little bit to that?
The most important prevention and treatment of osteoporosis is getting enough exercise, particularly resistance exercise and weight-bearing exercise. So you want to make sure that you're hitting the gym or you're lifting some weights. It's the muscles that pull the bones and activate them and keep them metabolically active. It's the sedentary lifestyle where we don't move that's the underlying cause of osteoporosis. So getting adequate nutrition is just a super small part of preventing and treating osteoporosis. Obviously, it's important, to get adequate nutrition, but it's just a super small part of it.
And is there sort of a target that people should reach for if they're like, okay, I need to get serious about like incorporating exercise for osteoporosis or for the prevention of it? Is there a certain amount, number of days, number of weights that they should reach for if they want to implement that?
Absolutely. 30 minutes 3 times a week should be a minimum, of using some kind of resistance training or weight-bearing exercise. You can also, if you're somebody who likes to go on walks, you can just add super light weights, and you can just move your arms while you're walking here and there. So it's not only about the weight itself, how much weight you're lifting. You just want to challenge the muscles, and you want to feel them.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. You want to feel them. Yeah, because then it's a little less technical, and then you can just decide, okay, do I feel this? Then this is probably good. Okay, that's great. That's wonderful. Let's talk about.
By the way,
yes.
You know, I know somebody who she's in her 80s and she ran her first marathon when she was 70. And she's super thin and super fit on a whole food plant-based diet. And a few years ago, they told her that she has osteopenia, so the initial stage of, of developing osteoporosis down the road. So she took it seriously and she started just using light weights when she's walking or when she's running. Not all the time, but just, a few times a week. And the results were fairly quick. In a 1 year follow-up, she completely, changed her bone density, and it was in completely normal.
Wow.
So the changes can happen fairly quickly, but you need to be, consistent with your exercise. It doesn't take much. I just want to stress that you don't need to do like superhuman, like super heavy weights. No, you just want to challenge your body a bit, and you want to keep moving, and you want your bones to be challenged as a result of challenging your muscles. That's all.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I think that's very hopeful for people to hear that. And I know you can buy like those weights that kind of wrap around your ankles and even wrap around your wrists, and that can be an
Exactly.
easy way to incorporate that. So that's fantastic. That's great. What an inspiration. I would love to talk about protein a little bit, because I know also on these guidelines the protein recommendation went up, and that's not necessarily based on any updated scientific research. So can you talk about what you think of the current protein guidelines from this new updated guidelines? I didn't realize that the RDAs didn't change, and that was a
That's
whole kind
right.
of separate thing from the dietary guidelines that just were put out. So can you talk to that?
Daily dose is the same. It's roughly 0.6 to 0.8 grams per kilogram a day. So it would be roughly 50 grams a day for women, 60 grams a day for men. And if you want to consume more, sure, you can eat more beans and tofu and drink more soy milk, but it's not necessary. In our culture, protein is being just overemphasized and overrated. And sometimes we're being told that if we don't eat these crazy amounts of protein, we will not have enough muscle. Again, that's false. For muscle, you need to challenge your muscles in order for them to
Yes.
grow.
Yes.
So yes, you want to have enough protein, but if you just eat twice as much protein than you need and you don't move, that's not good. It doesn't help anything. The extra protein will be converted into fat, and you will just get more fat as a result.
Okay, so that's interesting, actually. I want to stop you right there, because I was going to ask, okay, if we get if we have too much, like more protein than our body requires, what happens to that protein? And is it different depending on what source of protein that is? So if it's animal-based protein, does it act differently than if it's plant-based protein with the excess?
Yeah, the excess will be simply converted into fat. It's not as easy to convert it into fat as when you're consuming too much energy in the form of fat. If you're just, putting a lot of olive oil on your salad, that extra fat may be stored immediately, basically. Not much energy is required. For protein and for carbohydrates that we take extra, the body will probably spend some energy, roughly 25%, like converting them into fat before storing those extra calories in the form of fat. So that's better than consuming extra energy in the form of fat, but not too much. The bottom line is that too much of anything is not good for your body. It will just disrupt metabolism at the end. And are there any differences between plant protein and animal protein? Absolutely. When it comes to the risk of all-cause mortality, risk of dying from any cause. Extra animal protein increases the risk dramatically. Extra plant protein doesn't. So there's quite a few metabolic differences between animal protein and plant protein. It's mainly because of the branch-chained amino acids that are particularly in animal products, and those promote insulin resistance and the development of diabetes down the road, and also cardiovascular disease. So there are differences, but the bottom line is that you don't need any crazy amounts of protein. I know that they're selling protein water nowadays.
Yeah.
We don't need it, okay? We don't need isolated protein. We don't need a protein bar that contains 40 grams of protein. Like, nobody needs it.
It's just everywhere. And what I hear often, well, okay, so there's a few things. I've heard so many times people saying, if you are like middle-aged and if you're a woman and if you're trying to lose weight, you have got to up your protein. Like, I've heard that story, and that's kind of like a new one. Like, I've been in the plant-based world like practically my whole life. That's a kind of new one I'm hearing. So can you talk a little bit about that and why that might be a little off?
Follow the money is the shortest answer. I mean, there's a demand for these products and people are trying to sell them. They're trying to make a case for why we need protein. And, they're arguing that if you work out, you need protein for your muscles. Well, you do, but you don't need any crazy amounts. What you need is fairly covered by beans and tofu and soy milk.
Yeah, and if you're eating enough calories, then you should be getting enough if you're eating those those types of foods. So and I think that it's like a trickle effect, because like the whole protein thing. I see people, a lot of influencers will talk about it, and then just normal people will see the influencers talking about it, and all of a sudden you just have these people just saying all of this, and it's not backed by science, it's not backed by anything, and it's just sort of this social narrative. A wave of the social narrative comes through, and so it's kind of frustrating, because then it's good to follow the money, look at the science, and really make sure that there's a reason, or where these people are getting their information. Because I mean, even just going to the gym, there's so often just like the trainers, and they don't know, but they're so convinced that they do know. So it can be really conflicting. And I see a lot of just really mainstream podcasts as well talking about this, who a lot of people listen to those podcasts. And I heard the other day, and it wasn't the first time, I heard people talking about the grams of protein per gram of body weight instead of per kilogram of body weight as well. And I was like, wait, do they know, like, do they know that they're saying this? Are they meaning to say this? Because that's going to be much different, a pound versus a kilogram, So anyways, okay. And one last question about protein, just because I know that people will have questions about it. What about as we get older? Do the requirements go up as we get older?
So this recommendation is based on the decrease in muscle mass in older people. And again, protein is just a small part of the equation. Yeah. The most important thing is that you want to keep moving. You want to keep your body moving so that the muscles are being challenged and you at least keep the muscle mass. And before you get old, you want to make sure that you're moving to maximize the muscle mass you have so that you're not completely fragile, like a few decades from now.
Okay, I like it. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's like if all you do is eat a lot of protein without actually building your muscles aren't going to be magically very strong in a few days.
That's right.
It just doesn't, it doesn't make logical sense. So thank you for that. Very helpful. So there's a couple questions that I had from the community, and one of the questions, I thought it would be a really good question for you, given your background, but about the pros and cons of hormone replacement therapy, and if there's anything new about it or your thoughts on it?
That's an excellent question. Well, first of all, is there any alternative for postmenopausal women? We did a study where we put women on a whole food plant-based diet. We kept the fat content low, and we supplemented this diet with half a cup of cooked soybeans every day for the isoflavones, for the phytoestrogens. And on this type of diet, with the half a cup of cooked soybeans every day, the hot flashes were reduced by 88%, the moderate to severe hot flashes. And when it comes to the severe hot flashes that wake you up at night or that interrupt the meeting, those were reduced by 92%. So they almost disappeared.
Wow.
So is there any alternative to the hormone replacement therapy? Yes, a whole food plant-based diet, and you want to supplement those phytoestrogens. You want to get enough soy products. Why did we use half a cup of cooked soybeans? Well, this amount of cooked soybeans gives you roughly, what you need in terms of the phytoestrogens. Can you get them from tofu and soy milk? Absolutely. But you just need much higher amounts. So the easiest way to get enough isoflavones and phytoestrogens is roughly half a cup of soybeans every day. You can think about it as a medication, so it's up to you. Do you want to take a pill or a patch, or do you want to eat your soybeans? And it's in combination with a whole food plant-based diet and minimizing the oil consumption. We found out that those participants, the study lasted 12 weeks. We had 84 women who were postmenopausal and were suffering from hot flashes. And during those 12 weeks, some women accidentally, or they were traveling and they, deviated from the study diet in just a little bit. Like, for example, when you travel, it may be challenging to find all the foods that are low fat, right? And we found out that each deviation usually resulted in more hot flashes the next few days. So each component is critical. The whole food plant-based, minimizing the oils, and consuming the soybeans.
Okay.
Why is it a better alternative than the hormone replacement therapy? Well, because the hormone replacement therapy has significant side effects, mainly the increased risk of breast cancer. So, if you have an alternative like this one, this is where I recommend that people start. And then obviously, you want to consult your physician and then see what makes sense for you specifically. But you always need to weigh the risks and the benefits.
Okay, and with those soybeans, were they just whole dried soybeans, just cooked?
That's right.
And just eaten like that? You could probably put some little seasonings on them or some nutritional yeast, maybe.
Exactly. Those were the mature soybeans. So no, not edamame. Edamame is also excellent, but it's just an immature soybean that has a lower content of isoflavone. So these were just the mature soybeans, and the women cook them usually in a pressure cooker or an Instapot, and they put them in different dishes. One of the favorite recipes in our study was that after cooking them, they put them on a parchment paper and baked them in the oven with different spices like garlic and smoked paprika. And that way they also got the crunch.
Okay, that's a great idea. So that's really, very helpful, very cool information. Okay, so I know that some people are going to be listening to this and they're like, yeah, but soy causes cancer and soy causes man boobs and soy causes all these horrible things. So can you just talk about soy real quick and why that might need to be reconsidered?
Yeah, studies actually show the opposite. Studies show that women who consume the most soy have a much lower risk of breast cancer than those who consume very little soy. And also when it comes to women who've been already diagnosed with breast cancer, those who ate the most soy had the highest survival rates compared with those who ate very little soy. And when it comes to man boobs, well, show me a man who developed man boobs from soy. I mean, when you walk down the beach, just try to ask these men, what's your most favorite food?
Yeah.
Usually they will tell you a hamburger, right? Like,
Yeah.
like a standard American diet.
It's not going to be soy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, some of these people are not eating that because they're afraid of it. But what's happening is like that's already could be already an issue. So
no, so
yeah,
it
well,
does not
okay.
cause man boobs.
Yes, or cancer, and it's frustrating that we have that information so swapped, right? It's like really the opposite. And so thank you for bringing that up and for touching on that. Very, very helpful. Let me just see if there's any more interesting questions here. So I covered that. Already. Somebody had a question about kidney disease and potassium / foods to avoid.
At different stages of kidney disease, the guidance may be a little bit different. So in the early stages of kidney disease, there may be no strict restrictions on potassium. And obviously, as the kidney disease progresses, there may be some considerations that are necessary. The potassium-rich foods include potatoes and bananas. So you just want to be careful with those foods if you are in later stages of kidney disease.
Okay, and then there was an interesting question here about okay. So the question is, can you comment on why US guidelines for treating hypothyroid only address T4 replacement, whereas if I understood correctly, there's ample evidence that T3 is also affected and that T3 replacement is addressed somewhere like Europe. So I'm not exactly sure about all that, but I'm sure that that's more your language. So what do you say to that?
So when we measure the thyroid hormones, we'd like to see the TSH and the free T4 levels. The free T4 levels are more important than the overall T4 levels. And that will determine the treatment. There's quite a few forms of thyroid hormones, and you just need to consult it with your physician. And
Okay.
it's hard to recommend something in a program like this because
of course.
thyroid disease has so many causes. So you just need to consult it with your physician. But when it comes to the labs, you want to measure TSH and free T4.
Okay, very helpful. And then I just wanted to get your take quickly about on like 3 different foods and just see what you have to say about them, because these are the things that are kind of like even within the whole food or within the plant-based community, sometimes there can be a little bit of like people not really agreeing or different kind of advice. So the first one is oil, and you talked about oil a little bit, but I would like to kind of hear your take on oil, not necessarily saturated, not like coconut oil, but like olive oil, stuff like that.
To start the answer, it's much better to consume oil than butter, but we don't want to overdo it with oil either. Mm-hmm. And let me just reference the study done by Monica Agarwal, where she put people on a whole food plant-based diet, but in one half people were consuming very little olive oil, less than a teaspoon a day, and in the second half more 4 tablespoons a day, like on the Mediterranean diet. It's been recommended, and it was a crossover study, so people tried both, and the result was that there were benefits of a whole food plant-based diet on both the low fat and higher fat dietary approaches. but people lost more weight, their cholesterol went more down, and their glycemic control was better on the low-fat approach when even the olive oil was minimized. So that kind of frames the answer. It's a good idea to be mindful of our fat content in the diet, and be cognizant of the fact that even the so-called healthy plant fats, when we consume too much of them, that may not be so good for us.
Okay. And I actually had her, Dr. Agarwal, on the podcast. And so I'll link to that episode in the show notes as well. It was a really good conversation. And then the second food is seitan. So high protein wheat. It's called like wheat meat. That was like, back in the day what it was called. But what do you think about that?
Great question. For people who are not gluten intolerant, it can be incorporated. It's not an isolated protein or an isolated food that I would be more concerned about.
Okay.
It's still, but my rule of thumb is that these types of foods may be included probably occasionally and not on a daily basis. But it's my personal approach, and obviously, if you're a big fan of seitan, like do what you see fit for your own health.
Okay. And then the last food is just sourdough bread. What are your thoughts on that?
Sourdough bread has a better effects on our glycemic control with other preparations of bread. It's also important which flour we use. For example, rye flour will have a beneficial effect on the glycemic control compared with wheat. And also, when we say wheat, what kind of wheat? We know that wheat has been hybridized in the US and may spike the blood sugar. When we use spelt or einkorn, those are the traditional varieties of wheat that don't spike the blood sugar as much. So if you can use rye bread, even better, pumpernickel bread, or at least half and half. That's a traditional European way to put half rye and half wheat flour. It's a part of a healthy diet, so you don't need to be worried about it.
Okay. And just, make sure you eat those beans and greens and all the other whole plant foods. Yeah, it's all about balancing it out. Okay. So those are all my questions for you. We covered a lot. There was so much good information. I know that people are going to listen to this and just learn so much. What did I miss? Is there anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
We covered everything. And if somebody feels a bit overwhelmed right now, that there's so much they need to do, I'd like you to just start with one thing that you learned today. Maybe it's going to bed 15 minutes earlier, or maybe it's including weights, on some of your walks. It may be just one thing, or maybe it's eating more leafy greens. Just define one thing and stick to it for the next few weeks and see what kind of difference it makes.
Love it. Okay. Well, I really appreciate all of your expertise and your time and for talking with me. This has been a wonderful conversation. So thank you so much, Dr. Kahleova. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Molly.
Okay. Bye-bye. Did you know that Clean Food Dirty Girl has a club? We do. It's called the Clean Food Dirty Girl Meal Plan Club. And if you want to eat more plant-based meals that are delicious, that are damn good, that will have you craving them, if you want to feel energized and healthy from head to toe, if you want to save time in the kitchen each week, if you want to use all of the groceries that you actually buy, and if you want the omnivores in your life to say, yum, to the plant-based meals that you're cooking, you have got to join us. Go to cleanfooddyrtygirl.com, and on the homepage, you can find out more. I would love to see you in the club. It is the best. Come find out what all the buzz is about. It is life-changing, and I would love to have you. Thank you for listening to this podcast and for being in our sphere. If you can rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to them, that would be badass. Thank you so much for spreading the dirty love.